Good afternoon. Thank you for being here, and thanks for bearing with us for a couple minutes here. I'm Stefan Yost. I'm the Michael and Sonia Kerner Director and CEO of the AGO, and it really does make me pleased when I see a room full of people on a Sunday afternoon and who brave the cold. I'm sure our coat check is pretty busy, too. We like to begin by acknowledging we're on the territory of the Mississauga of the Credit. Toronto is home to many different First Nations, and in this region, there's the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, among others. Today is the last day of the Pasita Abad show. How many of you have seen that? Okay, good number. For those of you who haven't, it's a marvelous, amazing show. And one group of that, of her work, really focuses on abstraction. So we tend to think about her narrative work, but there's a whole period where she's really engaging in abstraction and painted quilts. And so if you get a chance after this, do go down and see this Pasita Abad show. Debbie Johnson, who's here tonight, or this afternoon, and I curated a show called Moments in Modernism. How many of you seen that? Okay, good, great. It was a great deal of fun to work with Debbie on that. And everything on view there was from the AGO storage. Right, everything was. And we could have made the show 4 times bigger and still maintained the quality of it. One of the reasons I'm mentioning that is that the collections of the AGO are really, really rich. They're incredible. The generosity of people here in Toronto towards giving great works or helping us purchase great works of art is nothing short of humbling. And as many of you know, Danny Reese Modern Contemporary Gallery is under construction. Last week, the steel started to go up after 6 months of putting in foundations. And so very quickly in the next 4 or 5 months, you'll see the building go up. And I bring that up because it'll be 40,000 square feet of gallery space primarily for works from our collection because we want to show it. And it's for modern and contemporary art, basically art after 1900. We'll open it in early 27, so we still have a ways to go, but it's really this generation's kind of gift to the public. And fundraising has been really strong, actually humblingly strong. So we're pleased with how that's going. But the link here is we want to show things like our extraordinary Rothko and other works that are in storage. And so we're just trying to make public space for great works of art. It's not that complicated. So that show, Moments in Modernism, also received support. So I'm going to say some thank yous to supporters. Baker Tilly, Toronto, if you need an accountant. McCarthy Tetro, if you need a lawyer. Just thank you to both of those groups. Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin, Jay Smith and Laura Rapp, Marion and Gerald Soloway, and also we've had some anonymous donors. I'm always thrilled when people are like, just say we're anonymous, because much of the philanthropy here is actually that. It's anonymous. Today's talk, Mark Rothko and the Inner World, by Christopher Rothko, should prove to be really, really interesting. Rothko is one of those artists who kind of jumps from one generation to another. And as many of you know, that our audiences are really young. And one of the things that just makes Debbie and I smile is when you go into the gallery and you're listening and some like 19-year-old is, oh my God, who's this? I've found this artist. They're really amazing. This Rothko guy, right? You know, having no idea how art historically important the art is, but how the work just transcends and kind of connects with the next generation. For those of you who are coming in, there's some vacant seats up here. There's some over there, too. Just be a little bold and find a seat. Christopher Rothko is a writer and a psychologist. We just had lunch with him, and he's also incredibly knowledgeable about classical music. Yesterday he went to the TSO and had a very enjoyable concert. It's another nice way to spend an evening is to go to the TSO. He actively involves in managing Mark Rothko's estate. He's written extensively about his relationship with his father, his art, and most notably his book, Mark Rothko From the Inside Out. There's copies of it in the gift shop if you want to learn more. He's curated several exhibitions for museums and galleries around the world, and most recently curated a retrospective of Rothko's work at Fondation Louis Vuitton in Paris, and our Rothko was one of the featured works there, so it kind of made us feel really good. And it made me feel really good how Rothko's been truly embraced by the next generation. So without further ado, Christopher Rothko.
Welcome. Wow, this is an amazing crowd. Well, it's great. It's great to be back in Toronto. Great to be back at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And I'm going to do my best over the next hour or so to convince you that there really is something better you could have been doing with your time. But I'm thrilled to have you here while I've got you here. So this is a talk. Actually, one of the first talks I wrote, and I gave it for the first time in 2003 at a centenary celebration and symposium on my father's work in his hometown of, today it's Daugavpils, Latvia. But when he was there, it was in Dvinsk, part of the greater Russian Empire. And it was really a fabulous experience. A hall, actually, I think it held almost 2,000 people, an old movie theater, every seat packed. And I was invited as a psychologist to speak about my father's work, and I think the understanding was that I was going to, as a psychologist, really talk about my father's personalities, his foibles, all the darkness, what have you. And I guess I played a little trick on them, which was actually very true to my father, which is instead of talking about my father's psychological state, I instead talked about how his artwork helped you see your own psychological state. So this talk has morphed a little bit over time. It's much shorter than it was, like, I think, an hour and 40 minutes. And my poor wife was, remember transparencies and overhead projectors? She was literally moving them one to the next. That really put our marriage in danger for a little while. But somehow everybody got through this. I did do it in two halves. You didn't have to sit there for an hour and 40 minutes. But it's changed a lot since then. But it's still one of my favorite talks. I'm thrilled to give it again. I assure you that the paintings have changed a lot in that time, but I'm exactly the same. All right, and the good thing about it is it is richly illustrated, so you don't actually have to look at me anymore. You can look at these screens, and hopefully what I'm saying actually has some relevance to what's on the screens in front of you. Mark Rothko's paintings, and especially his classic works, of which this is a 1951 example, they've long been viewed as expressions of feeling. They're broad expanses of paint, they're bold juxtapositions of color, they're frameless all-over painting. All of these things point to, and they also reach for like a further sense of space, right? And all of these speak to something that is being declared, something that the artist can barely contain, and which he needs to make public. Now, this is the very opposite of art that depicts what is in the tangible world of objects around the artist. There's no pastoral scene here. There's no glowering royal countenance. There's no likeness being rendered. And nor do these seemingly minimalist abstractions appear to convey flights of fancy or a new view of the world through a new type of lens. There really is no external world here. No scene to grasp onto, no place or frame of reference. The surface, in fact, seems so void of content, of action, of narrative, ultimately of any cues that would tie them concretely to the world of objects. And yet, these paintings are not voids. And I'll talk about that quite a bit, but this is something my father was always insistent about, is that behind what seems like nothing, there's a lot of content, or he wouldn't have bothered to paint them. So in the late 1960s, the great Italian filmmaker Michelangelo Antonioni, and this is a still from his, I think a lot of people consider his masterpiece, Red Desert. He sought out my father, who spent the summer in Italy in 1966. He sought him out, eager to have a meeting of minds. I paint nothing. You paint nothing, I film nothing. And that was the premise for the summit. Actually, we have no details of the conversation they actually had, but you can sort of see on the surface why he was interested in having this conversation. There, as you can look here, and this is one of my father's last works, one of the Black and Gray series from 1969. You see these open spaces, this unadorned abstraction, this sort of aching search for meaning that marks both of their work. And there is a phenotypic similarity in their best-known pieces that presents the viewer with an emptiness that must somehow be filled. But here the comparison really breaks down, for while Antonioni, and I I make no pretense of being a film scholar at all, but to my mind, he presents us with a modernist crisis, a man-made world that's vacuous and artificial. But Rothko's paintings, for all their reduction in means, are bursting with energy and alive with the human spirit. The void they present is only a void of references to the outside world, and precisely because my father sought to remove the distractions and preoccupations with the material realm. He wanted to shift our focus and draw our attention to the inner world, the world of ideas, and most critically, the world of emotion. This is a 1959 work on paper, about as good as it gets. If any of you were lucky enough to see this, either the show at the National Gallery in Washington or at the National Gallery in Oslo this past year, this was one of many wonderful works there. So Rothko's goal was to connect the human spirit and to express what he called the human condition. And this is not a radical idea. In many ways, it's a highly romantic notion with a refreshing touch of naivete and an artist who is known for being very intellectual and a rather serious painter. Rothko's great innovation was with the means he used to achieve this expressive goal. The boldness to throw away most of the painterly elements in an attempt to penetrate to the heart of our emotional world with a single arrow, so to speak. People talk of great art expressing the inexpressible, and this is clearly the realm that preoccupied my father. Art that is narrative, descriptive, or reflective of its time and place is inherently limited to the bounds of its frame, and that's both a physical, social, but also a temporal frame. This is painting that, at least on its most basic level, could have its subject expressed in words. Now, of course, we all know countless examples of works that transcend their conventionality of their subjects to communicate in a profound and deeply emotional way. But Rothko sought to leap neatly over all those pictorial elements and through direct, unblunted expressive means, speak straight to the inner. And one can see this even in his earliest figurative work, where there is often no focus on character, no attempt to tell you what kind of people he has painted. Instead, the focus is on their state, their condition, where they are physically, and how this has affected them. That is, how this has affected them emotionally. I mean, you can see that this is also not a very real or believable space. Already there's a type of abstraction, and not just in the roughly drawn figures. These are not people that we could get to know. These are figurative representations of a human condition that most of us will know in our own personal way. But that human condition is equally present in his late classic color field paintings, works my father referred to, and without irony I might add, as dramas. Of all the statements my father made about his work, and he did not make many, I think this is perhaps the most enlightening. First, because drama places us definitively in the human realm. The paintings are not about color or form, the process of viewing, and they are not about abstract ideas. These paintings are a stage for human concerns and human interaction, as drama, unlike narrative, inherently involves interaction. Secondly, seeing the paintings as dramas takes us out of the realm of the static and shifts our focus from the surface. For what types of dramas are these if they are not psychological dramas? There are no tangible actors on this stage, just raw feelings expressed ever so directly, sometimes with an almost brutal power, sometimes more caressingly. These feelings, mediated only through the most basic elements of color and form, are in constant interplay, sometimes harmonious, sometimes contentious, and almost always, like real emotions, in the ambivalent admixtures which continually tint our world. There is no black and white Rothko, and nor do I suspect there's really much black and white in our own lives. This, by the way, is one of just a few transitional paintings that join him from his earliest abstractions to what we know as Rothko's. This is a 1948 or a 49 painting that is very much, as you can see, almost there. To help us understand the ways that the paintings interact with us, let us consider some typical responses from viewers to Rothko's work. Moving is the most word I frequently hear from those who love Rothko. I think the word is significant because it speaks to the physicality of our emotional response. We are on such an elemental level that we're having a bodily reaction to the work. It is primitive, visceral. Movement also brings up the notion of things resonating, of being stirred. When the window on the soul is looked through, when the interaction between viewer and painting genuinely occurs, a chord is struck, and the reaction is, at least in part, basic, physical, and involuntary. The most striking manifestation of the physical response to a Rothko painting is, in fact, crying. To see a viewer in tears before a Rothko painting is not uncommon, and at least in my experience, it occurs as often with men as it does in women. My father was keenly aware that people were moved to tears before his paintings and was frankly rather proud of it. He cited it as evidence that his work truly was brimming with content, specifically tragic content, and that he not only could, but did reach his viewers in a profound and affecting way. So, why tears? It's not that the paintings themselves are sad. As we have discussed, they really have so little socially referenced content. It is not clear what would carry the message of sadness. One, of course, could argue that color carries this message, but it's too simple and often actually misleading to equate a brightly colored painting with joyous feelings and the darker ones with sadness. I can add that in my own limited research, I found that viewers cry as often before the light works as they do before the dark ones. And in the case of these two paintings, we have a beautiful painting in the collection of the National Gallery in Washington from 1954 on the left, and of course the Art Gallery of Ontario's fabulous 1962 painting on the right. I'm not sure which is the sad painting here. I don't see a sad painting. I just see two paintings that get deep under my skin. Ultimately, I believe this examination of sadness is somewhat off the mark, for it is not at all clear that the tears shed before a Rothko painting are actually tears of sadness. Those predisposed to do so cry in many different states, in joy or rage, in relief or fear, in accomplishment as well as failure, and I will add, at weddings as much as at funerals. Our emotional experiences before a Rothko is an essentially physical process, like the wind through a pipe or vibration across a string that causes a note to sound. Something is struck or strummed or plucked or bowed, hammered or brushed, and involuntarily, from a place before conscious thought, the tears come, unbidden, but not necessarily unwelcome. This is not sadness. This is meaning deeply felt. So, what are some of the mechanisms, psychological and artistic, which allow Rothko's work to communicate on an emotional level? Our first instinct is to look at color, but I cannot say clearly or vehemently enough that it's a mistake to equate Rothko paintings with color. My father's paintings are gestalts, carefully balanced visual wholes, and when they fail to achieve their most persuasive emotional expression, it's rarely because the colors are poorly chosen or not in themselves beautiful. It's usually because the formal balance is not quite optimal. So that said, let us examine some of the other mechanisms that bring expressive power to the work. The first of these mechanisms I call nebulousness. This is the cloudiness or indistinctness of the image that is common to all the periods of my father's work. Whether it is the human figure, and this is an example from the early 1930s called Family, or something more primordial from his surrealist phase. This was appeared about 5 or 6 years in the 1940s. That was constantly evolving. This is actually a very late surrealist work. You can see just the last vestiges of figuration in this painting. In a few more paintings, the figure has dissipated completely. We see this in the uncoalesced blots of color known as the multiforms. This is what immediately followed the Surrealist period in the mid to late 1940s. But of course, we also see it in the classic floating rectangles. And one rarely feels that the image is fully in focus. We are not entirely clear who or what we are seeing. This indistinctness means that we need to work a little harder, and that we are already drawn into an active relationship with the painting. But the nebulousness also invites a type of projection. I would argue an emotionally tinged projection. The artist is not telling us exactly what he is showing us. We must make sense of it through the mechanisms of our own psychological processes. Action is a second technical means my father employed to convey emotion. And perhaps this is a touch ironic or surprising that I should put forth action when for a color field painter, but well, undoubtedly more subtle and less central than it is for Pollock or Krasner or Franz Klein. Action is a key attribute of my father's work. Whether it's in the powerful movement of line in his surreal period watercolors, the working of the paint in some of the classic works, this is a very early classic painting from 1949, or the unexpected turmoil of the supposedly depression-dampened black and grays. Movement is essential in the work. Perhaps even more powerful is the dynamism of color, the movement that is created by the color itself. This is easily seen in the constant interplay of color in the multiform paintings, or the explosion of colors that occur around the borders of classic sectionals. And here I've just made a small detail of just the very left center edge of this painting, where you can see all these different layers of color coming together in a way that perhaps if you step back from the painting, you don't immediately perceive, but all those paintings are interacting in such a dynamic way. It's creating a sort of an undercurrent of volatility that's always there, and especially always look around the edges of the rectangles. It's where the action happens. So in these small areas of juxtaposition, the emotional energy is absolutely at its highest, and it becomes, as I said, nearly kinetic. Two additional expressive mechanisms pertain primarily to the classic paintings, although there are, of course, pre-echoes present in the earlier work. The first of these is what we in the Rothko family call inner glow. And this is seen in some of the most moving of the classic paintings. This is a 1951 work also in the National Gallery's collection. It is a glow that tells you that there's content beneath the surface, one that acts as an embracing invitation to turn inward. It is the window of inner light. The second of these mechanisms, or these emotional hooks, if you will, is the quiet presence of imperfection in virtually all of the work. Here I have contrasted a 1950 Joseph Albers' Homage to the Square with Rothko's number 12, 1951. Despite the commonality of bright color and the quasi-geometric presentation, the feeling emanating from the paintings could hardly be more different. For all their regularity and formal cleanliness, Rothko's paintings are clearly the work of the human hand. These are not Albers or Newmans or Reinhardts. The human factor, with all its fallibility, is present everywhere, in the work of the brush, in the forms that in truth only suggest rectangles, in the drips and splatters that mark every seemingly pristine surface. And I actually had a great conversation with curator Debbie Johnson just yesterday about the AGO's painting, which has all sorts of splatters on it that at first glance you don't see. You don't actually have to see them to have them sort of unconsciously filter in your brain and remind you that this is a human being painting this painting, and not trying to hide that in any way. So these subtle cues are, again, not so much intended to engage the viewer in the process of painting, but to lend the work an extra degree of the personal. These human elements reinforce the unconscious awareness that the viewing of a painting is an interaction between two people. The final expressive mechanism I would like to touch on is what my father saw as the essential content of his work. Not simply drama, but specifically tragic drama, what he called the tragedy of the human condition. My father most likely turned to Nietzsche, but I'm going to turn to Aristotle to help elucidate the workings of that tragic content in the paintings. Writing in the Poetics, Aristotle speaks of the finest tragedies arousing pity and fear in the spectator. Pity he defines as a human feeling occasioned by undeserved misfortune. The feeling of fear, however, stems from witnessing misfortune in one like ourselves. It is this second feeling, fear, but more particularly the recognition of one like ourselves, which is critical to my father. When faced with a painting, my father did not want the viewer to see it as something other, but as something directly relevant to the self, something that spoke to him or her in an immediate way about his or her life. The tragic elements of the work must resonate with the viewer, arousing a sense of familiarity from their own inner world. Now, this is not to underplay the more fearsome aspects of fear. There is a strong current of existential angst in Rothko's work, a preoccupation with death and ultimate causes. And yet, that does not seem to be the primary thrust for him in his embracing of the tragic. In reference to the tragic doom, he notes, "The fear of death and pain and frustration seems the most constant binder between human beings, and we know that a common enemy is a much better coalescer of energies than is a common positive end." The tragic, then, for him, is the ultimate expression of the common experience of mankind. Thus, in his paintings, he focuses on the essences, the defining elements of what it is to be human. The second significant aspect of tragic content is, well, the content. And it was no less crucial for Aristotle. He writes, no, didn't write it there. That's how Rothko writes it. This is how Aristotle writes it. The second significant aspect of he writes, the tragic fear and pity may be aroused by the spectacle, but they may also be aroused by the very structure and incidents of the play, which is the better way and shows the better poet. Rothko, too, had no use for spectacle. He was not interested in visual effects and artifice, but instead in the direct communication of the subject of his work. The forms and colors of his work are like the structure and incidents of the play. They are not there to stir what Aristotle called the spectacle of horror, but instead that pleasure of pity and fear. For Rothko, the surface is just that, surface. It is there only to serve the expression of the painting's content. Okay, now you get to see this painting. Lovely 1951 painting in my sister's collection. I keep trying to steal it from her. She doesn't let me very often. She's actually wonderfully generous, and we swap paintings back and forth all the time, but this one seldom leaves her home. How can we reckon this focus on the tragic with the many paintings that exude passion, exuberance, even joy? At least, as a partial answer, I will offer the example of Mozart, who was by a considerable margin my father's favorite composer. Mozart generally wears such a genial face. His pieces are so tuneful that it is frequently canned into Muzak packages or elevator music, much as my father's work is sometimes reduced to wall decoration. But listening to Mozart, carefully and openly, one becomes aware of the sadness, the longing, the ache of human suffering. My father would often say that Mozart was smiling through tears, and perhaps I would suggest the same was true for him. At the core of Rothko's work is the interaction between viewer and painting, or rather between viewer and painting, viewer and painter. Seeing the paintings not as a culmination of former means or painterly processes, but instead as acts of communication will enhance our understanding of why they affect us so. For this was my father's career-long goal, not to express himself, but to interact, indeed to hold conversation with his viewer. Now, I don't usually like to dwell on the process of writing, but I need to share with you a slip I made when I was first preparing this talk. Psychologists love slips, by the way. They're generally packed with intended and unintended meaning. They are actually a gateway into the unconscious. Now, in this case, I had meant to write the words content and impact, referring to how Rothko's paintings affect us. But instead of writing content and impact, I elided the two and accidentally wrote contact. So here's the mathematical formula for that. And I shouted, "Eureka!" I literally shouted that at my computer, and I cried, and I said, because contact exactly summarized what I was trying to say. So Rothko paintings are about an encounter, a meeting of minds or souls between artist and viewer. Now, we all try to make contact, superficially through a wave, an exchanged glance, a telephone call, and more deeply through intimacy with those we feel truly understand us. Now, my father's needs and aims were no different, but he sought to make contact through the intermediary of art. And I have to tell you, at this point, I began to imagine my father wandering the streets of New York in the 1950s and 60s in search of the most casual conversation, but always needing to carry a 2-meter square painting with him in order to do so. And this photograph was perhaps my own unconscious inspiring that thought. So we know pretty clearly what he was trying from the first to communicate, that tragic content, our shared experience of the human condition. His quest as an artist was to find a medium that could convey that content universally, that tapped into our common experience and our psychological workings. He found through years of experimentation that the more elementally he expressed his version of the human, the more directly he could touch those places. Thank you. And speaks with us about what it meant to be alive. In just a minute, we're going to consider period by period that journey of development. But I want to emphasize that this development was one of style, and it was one of artistic language, but it was not of content or message. Because if there's one thing I'd like you to take away today, it's that the painting on the left and the painting on the right are really the same thing. Expressed differently, no doubt, but ultimately trying to speak to the same part of us. My father's development was one of stripping away layers to achieve greater and greater clarity, to achieve what he called the simple expression of a complex thought. But that thought was there from the very first. All right, I'm going to take a 30-second water break here, and then we're going to dive into Rothko Art History 101. So my father spent nearly 20 years of his career as an essentially realist painter, and this is not to say that he sought to make perfect, objective depictions of the world he saw, but that he painted the world around him and filled it with generally recognizable figures. His version of that world was, in fact, highly subjective, and it dealt more with inner truths than outward detail or accuracy of visual representation. Stylistically, this period is highly varied and includes a number of different genres, such as landscapes and portraits. This painting on the right is actually one of his earliest works on canvas. It's a portrait of his mother. My sister and I always thought it looked a little bit like a Russian icon. She recently had it cleaned. Now it looks like a Cézanne. So a rich layer of patina can completely change a painting. So landscapes and portraits, quite a few nudes. This painting always hung in my parents' bedroom. My mother dubbed it simply "the girl with the pointed ass." Clearly, her ability for deduction was quite advanced. And perhaps most importantly, what I call the urban psychodrama. There are many of these period paintings, one more mysterious than the next. We'll visit a couple more of these, but you are again left to not so much know these people, but wonder what's going through their mind and imagine yourself in their place. And then try and pick out exactly where in New York there are, which is a completely constructed environment. But sometimes you can see hints from certain buildings. Now, while there are many paintings from this period that are light, cheerful, even occasionally superficial, it is those which most directly express the tragic elements that most compel. Fear, and often an amorphous, ill-defined fear, is often lurking at the edge of otherwise untroubled works. More often, it is starkly and dramatically present, as in these two images. In neither case can we see the feared object or even offer a reasonable guess as its source. For the inhabitants of the painting, though, it is quite real and immediate. And while the fear we read in the faces certainly has an acute edge, there is also a sense that this is a wearing, omnipresent, habitual fear, one that has become a dispiriting and familiar part of their existence. The painting on the left might be from the end of the 20s. Most of the best known and most thoroughly worked out paintings are from the 1930s in his figurative period, which really stretches from about 25 to 1940. Now, perhaps my father's best work from this period is a series of paintings he made in the New York subway. And two are here. Here are two examples from around 1936 to 38. Here, Giacometti-like figures all but disappear behind support pillars, and hunched men and women blend in against the drab gray-green walls. The subway encapsulated, and I can say it still very much does this, encapsulated the dehumanizing aspects of urban existence during this period, with its stifling air, depressing colorless surroundings, and the insect-like behavior it demanded of its riders. There was no room for individuals in the subway, only faceless masses. My father saw the effects of the crushing urban environment on the people around him, as well as on himself, and depicted these effects in paintings filled with sadness and bitter irony. But for Rothko, it's not so much the masses who are suffering. It is the individual subsumed in that mass who is struggling to break free. It is that individual psychological drama that most interests him, not the larger social phenomenon or plight of the people as an oppressed class. Although, of course, he was a socialist. I think he would have been thrown out of New York if he was not a socialist at that time. But it's now 1940, and the ultimate freeing of form and emotional voice that is represented by the classic paintings is still 10 years away. But Rothko is about to take the first of two very important steps. Struck by the vibrancy of the Surrealist movement, which has recently swept the art world, he adopts, as do essentially all of his contemporaries in the New York school, elements of the method of that Surrealist style, even as he rejects much of its philosophical rhetoric. While his aesthetic world influence is by the great European Surrealists who have fled war-torn Europe for America, it is essential to note that Rothko adopts the style in large part because it takes him in the direction towards which he has always striven. That is, a more immediate and universal way of expressing the human experience. So here are some of the earliest examples from probably 1940. It's very hard to date paintings, especially early in my father's career. He only signed and dated paintings if they were leaving the studio for an exhibition or a painting sale. And there wasn't a whole lot of that happening in this period. So many of them were dated actually 20, 30 years later by him in a 2-day long horrible inventory process of just painting after painting being led in front of him, and he made some scrawl on it and assigned a date, sometimes somewhat arbitrarily. We're still dealing with the with the results of that. So thus begins his deconstruction of the figure, and quite literally, as you can see in these examples, that will ultimately lead him to abstraction. While there are several levels on which to understand these paintings, what is essential to us here is Rothko's breaking down of convention, both pictorial convention and conventional ways of viewing the subject, as he essentially turns the portrait inside out. He is stripping away typical societal reference and our typical conscious understanding of humanness in a social context. He's appealing to a more basic, more primitive part of us, bypassing the outside and going straight to the innards, as in the case of poor Oedipus, who is on the left there. In this effort to communicate on a more elemental level, my father, like many of the artists around him, embraced myth as a source of the content for his works. Myth appealed to him because it embodied a more universal language full of elements grasped readily by a large number of people. Most importantly, one of the cultural functions of a myth is to represent through story the basic existential questions basic existential questions of the human world. Myths address many of our most elemental thoughts and feelings. Thus, by using the language of myth, my father felt he could more directly address these basic human concerns and speak more immediately to our inner world. Now, perhaps influenced by Carl Jung and intrigued by the power of unconscious and preconscious processes, Rothko's paintings became increasingly abstract and fanciful beginning in 1943. Here are two particularly lovely watercolor examples of that. The figures now are barely recognizable, and they seem to come from earlier epoch in human experience, or perhaps even further up the phylogenetic tree. They are as primitive as the thoughts they represent, a transliteration of sorts of the language of the unconscious. They speak not so much to our waking mind as to the world of dreams, those most elemental parts of ourselves which serve as the cradle of the emotions. Most striking in these works is the new assertion of the brush. It does not hide itself in even strokes, but comes bursting to the fore, providing an active and sometimes turbulent field for the figures. These are not quiet works. They remind us of the violence that my father insisted was part of even his sunniest classic canvases. This is the volcanic energy of the primordial world, and although transformed as his style changed, it would remain an essential element of his work up through the last paintings. So just to give you a sense of scale, those two watercolors I showed you, I can even back up for a second. These watercolors are less than a meter wide and not much more than a meter high. But this fabulous canvas from 1946, Rites of Lilith, which is one of his last named paintings, by the way, is quite enormous, the largest painting he painted prior to his classic format, and is dealing with an apocryphal subject from the Hebrew Bible of Adam's first wife, Lilith, who was rejected in favor of Eve, and forever is a spirit haunting the world. And to this day, religious Jewish people will do lots of go through a number of rituals to ward away the evil eye from new babies, and it's always Lilith who is at sort of the center of the fear of what might happen to their babies. So don't mess with Lilith. And you can see the really truly fearsome element that he brings to this work. A movement towards greater and greater freedom is certainly the hallmark of the so-called multiform period of my father's work. This briefest stylistic phase of his career, lasting from just 1946 to 1948, constitutes the essential transitional step to the classic sectional work. It is also his first wholly original painting, not rooted in an older European tradition. As 1946 moves forward, the abstract figures of his surrealist work continue to break down until there was nothing left but the colors that accompany their shapes. And I will show you, that happen across three paintings. I remember I showed you that surrealist work with the sort of blue totemic figure in it. This is perhaps the next painting after that, followed by this painting, followed by this painting. And again, we don't have exact dates, but this is the process where we see the figure break down into really true abstraction with the power of shape and brush and, of course, color really becoming Rothko's tools to touch that place he was trying to get to with the myth. My father had abandoned mythic work in part in the previous 2 years, in large part, I believe, because it constrained him. Although it provided a pathway to unconscious, emotion-laden thought processes, it was an inherently culture-bound, socially referenced language. One needed to know the story of the myth and understand it in the context of its culture in order to engage with the painting. But more importantly, the language of myth was an adopted one. It was not Rothko's language. As myth receded to the role of subtext, color, which it had helped to carry the message of the mythic figures, came forward. By the end of 1946, color had become Rothko's new vocabulary. Here are a couple of lovely examples from 1948. Those colors, although carefully chosen, also speak to a type of abandon. They push and clash against one another in amorphous shapes that barely contain their content. They are bold, encompassing the dynamism of line and brush from the previous period, looking to bring the inner emotional level to the surface. Yet for all their freedom and the openness of the emotional content, the impact upon the inner world of the viewer has still not been fully realized. Much of the raw power we will soon see in Rothko's classic work is there, but has not yet been harnessed into the hammer stroke of intent. The artist needs one more bold leap to strip away one further layer and bring to focus the inner world he is showing us. The classic works, or sectionals, are Rothko's signature works and are well known for the deep feelings they evoke and their ability to speak the language of the sublime. They touch us because they know exactly where we live. They speak to us saying something on the order of, "This is what it feels like to feel this way." They are essentially the painted expression of what it is to be human and alive, filled with joy and sorrow, aspiration and despair, fears and hopes, and fears about our hopes. Is this greatly different from what my father's works have been saying for the previous 30 years? Actually, I'm not sure it's different at all. It is simply that my father is speaking in a different voice, bold, impassioned, confident, although never strident or shouted. What are the elements that allow the classic works to touch us so deeply? Perhaps the most important aspect is that my father finally found his universal language, color. Although different colors undoubtedly have different cultural connotations, my father was able to juxtapose them and present them in such a way that each painting functioned as its own world, where the colors had their own meaning, specific to the context of that painting. In this way, he made color his own language, but a language with the potential to speak to every viewer. The sheer sweep, size, and resulting power of many of the classic works is a second important element in their ability to move us. While I have argued ad nauseum that many of the greatest Rothko works are quite small, I've come to realize that this is the viewpoint of someone who has already been fully entranced by the larger paintings. The large works envelop the viewer and invite him or her in. This is an invitation to a self-contained world where one can lose oneself and perhaps in that process find oneself anew. And for all the grandness of scale, it is an intimate experience, a world unique to that particular encounter. It is not an accident that many of the paintings are person-sized and that my father urged curators to hang them close to the floor where the viewer can all but step into them. Please don't. Rothko wanted you and the painting to essentially look each other in the eye. Finally, there are the multiple layers of paint my father built up to achieve the effects of color and luminosity that are key to the emotional impact of the work. I'm going to go back to that small 1949 painting. Built up is probably the wrong term, for in many cases the layers are very thin and semi-transparent, a veil for another color to shine through. My sense of these layers is that they are a type of visual representation of emotional complexity. The feelings which the paintings touch are by no means unidimensional. They are rich and multifaceted and inherently contradictory. When we see layers of pink and green contributing to the makeup of a seemingly brooding black, we know that we are dealing with neither greeting card images nor greeting card emotions. We are delving into the many layered constructions of the inner world. Back to the AGO's wonderful painting. A consideration of my father's work from the last decade of his life, the 1960s, helps clarify, I believe, the essential emotional role of the viewer in realizing the work. Some viewers struggle with the work of the 1960s, typically suggesting that the generally darker colors are less appealing, even depressing. I don't believe, however, that this is the primary reason for the difficulty. For what began to change subtly several years after my father's palette began to darken was the means he used to express the emotional content of the work. Stripping away still more layers in search of clarity, the paintings became formally tighter, the rectangles more regular in shape, the layers of color were reduced, and the brushwork grew generally less and less visible until reappearing again in dramatic fashion in the last year of his life. This further simplification of his style can give the impression of less energy, of emotional restraint in comparison to the outpourings of feeling in the sensuous and extroverted works of the 1950s. To return to the glorious number 1, 1962, from the Art Gallery of Ontario's own collection, we can see, I'm sorry, I just moved to the wrong slide. There we are. We can see the more rectilinear composition, the minimal layering of color, and some reduction of brushwork. But I am certainly not noticing an absence of feeling. This, by the way, was a gift to the museum from the Women's Committee at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Anybody know if the Women's Committee still exists? I can't imagine in 2025, we're in 2025, yes, that you need a Women's Committee anymore, but I wholly endorse it. I think I want to join. This painting was painted in 1962. It was purchased in 1962. So they didn't go and look for something that would be really familiar as a Rothko or something that had already been sort of vetted by dealers and shown in museums. This was a painting, sort of hot off the press, and apparently I was just learning yesterday that initially they were looking at a Newman and then decided to take this Rothko painting instead. But I really think it speaks to a vision and boldness to take a painting that is the newest thing the artist had done, certainly what he wanted them to see, and to bring it not just to a museum, but to a foreign land. So really, congratulations. And I am continually in love with this painting every time I see it, and I just wouldn't leave the people at the gallery here alone until they loaned it to me for the Paris show last year. So very happy to see it there and very happy to see it here. So it's, in fact, not the case that the 1960s works are any less driven by or less formed from emotion than their predecessors. It is simply that the emotional material has become more highly focused and the content more specific. Color still carries the message, looking to engage with our innermost selves, but rather than bright, broad brushstrokes of feeling, we're presented with more pinpointed emotions, expressed through subtle interplay of very carefully juxtaposed colors. The weight and spatial relationship of the forms has also become very precisely balanced. Some of the earlier freedom is now gone. One could almost accuse my father of a type of emotional control over the viewer. There's another crucial aspect of the 1960s work that make it more difficult, and I would argue greater, than the work of the 1950s. Rothko is quite simply demanding more from his viewer. The demand is not in terms of harder work to understand the painting, it's an emotional demand. The viewer needs to bring more of him or herself to the painting. The color does not leap off the canvas to lure you in the same way. You need to meet these paintings more than halfway and offer more of your own emotional input. The primary visual mechanism responsible for this essential change in the character of the paintings is reflectivity. Whereas the many layers of color in the 1950s gave the luminous glow from within, the rectangles of the 1960s often shine with a reflecting sheen. Many times, forms of quite similar color will interact with one another through subtle differences in reflectivity. The technique probably stemmed from my father's work on the Seagram mural commission in the later 1950s. And any of you who have been to the Tate Gallery in London or the Kawamura Museum in Japan will have seen installations of groups of these mural paintings, which were painted for the Four Seasons restaurant in New York, but which my father, in a fairly public story, withdrew from once he ate there. He said, "Forget about it." I guess he did not like the filet mignon, but. So here he was painting often burgundy-colored rectangles on a burgundy-colored background, causing the rectangles to stand out from the background by their greater reflectivity. And just to share a little triviality with you, I was actually looking for a good image of this painting that would show up well on a screen, and I ended up pulling it off the web, a website known as myKidCouldPaintThat.blogspot. I have no shame. It worked, so I used it. So while the visual impact of this change in technique can be relatively subtle, the emotional impact is quite significant. The 1950s paintings invited you in. These paintings are keeping you more at arm's length. It is, after all, hard to lose yourself in a painting that is shining back at you. Although this amazing black on the most sensuous 82% cocoa solids chocolate painting, if you stop and look, it'll lure you in. But it's not the walk by in the museum and immediately stop painting. It's the one that you have to make a decision to stop in front of. So it's not that the work of the 1960s is cold or unemotive. It's simply that they make more explicit what had been implicit all along in Rothko's work. The paintings are about you. Rothko is almost literally holding up a mirror for you to see yourself in. Now, the clearest and most all-encompassing example of this effect is the Rothko Chapel in Houston. Can I see a show of hands? How many of you have been to the Rothko Chapel before? No, not bad. Anybody been since it was renovated and the lighting and the skylight changed in 2021? Just a smattering? Okay. The great thing about doing this talk, which I haven't done in a little while, was I got to update the photos. So that is the chapel as it now exists. Although it is so impossible to capture the color. These are in fact not black paintings, but they're dark, absolutely. Now, this is not simply a group of murals, but it's an entire space designed by my father in the 1960s, and it's generally regarded as the very culmination of his work, although there are some who do find it off-putting. Now, those who don't like the chapel and the atmosphere my father created speak of it as a cold place, with paintings that are unyielding, monochromes that don't engage the viewer visually or emotionally. There's simply not enough there to stimulate. Now, these viewers are, in fact, absolutely correct, and have given what I'm sure is an accurate account of their experience. There was something missing at the chapel, an absolutely crucial element: themselves. And this is not to find fault with those people. The chapel's a very unsettling place. You feel very much alone. Nothing comes from the paintings, or almost nothing. It's all about you. It's almost a formula for an instant existential crisis. And I actually, on my first time at the chapel, initially had a very similar experience. I spent 2 hours before the chapel opened, alone one morning. This is, well, I wrote 20 years ago. It's now 29. And everything was absolutely silent in the room. And I can tell you, I had to fight a very strong urge to leave. I felt so isolated in that empty space, like a tiny speck in a great universe. But I resisted that urge to flee, and as I walked around the octagon, because these paintings surround you on all sides, 14 paintings in an octagon-shaped 3 triptychs. So I'm walking around the octagon, surrounded by huge murals on all sides, and I begin to realize that what I was uncomfortable with was not the paintings or the space. I was uncomfortable with myself. And I was in a room full of mirrors, dark, unyielding mirrors, and I was standing at their point of coincidence so that they were reflecting back on me. And the next hour was really a process of adjusting to looking at myself, and only myself, and learning from what I saw. It was a deeply rewarding experience, but honestly quite unnerving. I had a somewhat similar experience almost a decade later when the Tate Modern opened in London. There were several mammoth Louise Bourgeois sculptures in the more mammoth Turbine Hall. These three works were named beguilingly I Do, I Undo, and I Redo. And these were towers that you could climb up, and they had a small observation deck at the top. And mounted, as you can see at the top of this deck, were 4 mirrors, by means of which you could look at the various parts of the hall. But when you stood at the center between the 4 mirrors, they showed you only different views of yourself. So it's more playful than the chapel, and certainly less overwhelming, but I think ultimately sending a similar message of getting us to look to the same place for answers. The chapel makes patently clear what I have learned is true of all Rothko paintings. They yield only what you put in. The paintings only work, they will only speak to our own inner worlds when we are open to their invitation or suggestion. Ultimately, to understand a Rothko painting is to understand what the paintings help us see in ourselves. Thank you very much. Thank you. We've left some time for question and answers, and a couple of the people from the public engagement office at the AGO are here with microphones, and so if you have a question, put up your hand, and they will bring the microphone to you, and I will attempt to evade your question with an answer about something else. Thank you for breaking the ice.
I've heard of many recommendations on how far away people should look at your father's paintings from his recommendations, that you'd be very close to standing far away. What would you recommend, if anything?
So I don't know if all of you could hear the question. The question is, what is the recommended viewing distance from a Rothko painting? And I think you referenced my father's answer to this question, which you have to remember with my father, he loved irony. And this got him in trouble because irony doesn't work in print. So there are lots of statements that he made that were, a little smart alecky at the time. Always with the element of truth, but now they're forever embedded. So his answer to that question was 18 inches. But what he actually says in another place is that he wanted the viewer to have the same religious experience when viewing the painting that he had when making the painting. And that's really what that 18 inches are about. He wants you enveloped by the experience of looking at the painting. I actually think distance from a painting is a very personal thing, and I just recently, after dozens of years of spending time in front of Rothko's, had someone point out to me that I look at paintings from quite far away, that my father's paintings from quite far away, which is not to say when I'm looking at them for condition issues or I'm looking at a little spot where the colors come together, which is fascinating to do, but I look at them from a distance. And remember, I called them gestalts. That's how artwork works for me. It's a holistic, stop that. It's a holistic experience, right? I'm taking in the whole experience. But I really think that's going to be different for different people. And there are definitely good things to see up close. Don't get too close or the alarms will go off. But yeah, I think that's very much a personal thing and things to be learned from all distances.
Hi, I know that sort of in better critical practice, you're supposed to separate the artist from the art, but inevitably so many people read the biography of your father to the last paintings and the works on paper and the black and the gray. And, you can't help but make the association with what was happening with him psychologically. What's your take on that? Because I have read, too, that the late works really weren't necessarily a reflection of his inner life at the time, that they were about something else.
So could everybody hear the question? So that's I think, an important question. So I'm actually, before I became a psychologist, I was an English major, and I was trained very much at the time that the idea of a biographical interpretation of any kind of artwork was just anathema. But of course, we all do that, right? And it's natural, and you want to sort of know what's going on in their mind as they're creating these things that, can be hard to penetrate. So the answer specifically about the late work, there's no question that at the end of my life, end of his life, my father was deeply depressed. And he was actually in terrible physical condition. He'd had an aneurysm in 1968. He dies in 1970 by his own hand. He has an aneurysm, and he was laid up for months. But in those last 2 years, despite being incredibly depressed and really at death's door because of emphysema and his heart condition, he paints more paintings in that 2-year period than by far than any other period in his life. So he's just painting his way through this depression. And while there are very, very dark paintings, I actually don't think those black and gray paintings are so dark, by the way. They have dark elements, and they have very vibrant elements, and those gray areas always have color in them. They're either gray-yellow, gray-blue, gray-pink, and they actually have a red underlayer underneath all of them. But he's also painting very vibrantly colored, particularly works on paper, some very large scale, and the last series of his work, at the same time that he's making those black and gray paintings, are large scale works on paper in pastel type colors. And this is part of the reason I say don't equate color with mood, because how do you make sense of that? I actually don't try to make sense of that. I just look at the paintings and try to connect to each one of them individually. I think we have painting more hands in the front here.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was amazing. I was curious if your dad ever spoke about how he knew when a painting was finished.
I'm sorry, how he knew
when a painting he was doing was finished.
Oh, I'm assuming there are a lot of artists in the room, and I have a lot of artist friends. My father had a lot of artist friends, and we literally have one of them sadly just passed away. But we had a dear friend of my father, a wonderful painter named William Scharf, who, I hope we can revive his reputation, because he's sort of slipped off the viewpoint. But we couldn't invite him over for dinner because he would bring paints, and he'd see a painting and said, there's something a little bit out of balance there, and he'd go and fix it. So for some artists, a painting is a constantly evolving thing. But for my father, when a painting was done, he put it in the rack, and it was done, and he was going on to the next thing. Now, they stayed out for a long time, to the best we know. He really did not like being watched while he was painting, and he really did not have assistants except to help him stretch canvases and maybe sometimes mix some paints, make a pulley system for moving the paintings up and down. But he would have 4 or 5 paintings going at a time because there were so many layers they had to dry. So there's a long evolutionary process for each painting, but once he's done, he pretty much puts it away, and he doesn't come back to it. So the pictures of my father that are best known are of him sitting in his chair looking at the painting, and I think he painted them pretty rapidly, but then he would sit back and say, okay, is it done? What does it need? What's my next move? He usually did not have sketches of those paintings, so he had a broad idea of what he was doing. He had color in mind, but he'd see what was there, and he'd then decide on his next move. So much as we're trying to understand what's going on in the painting as we're viewing the painting, he was doing the same thing.
Would you know why rectangles?
Eat the mic. I can't hear you at all. I'm sorry.
Would you know why rectangles?
Why rectangles? Okay, so I get to trot out another one of my lectures, but I'll give you the very short version. So I have, actually my favorite essay ever on my father is called The Quiet Dominance of Form. And it's how, not only is it, I say here it's not about color, it's actually, I think that form is primary, that form actually really dictates the way we interact with the paintings. And look, this is strictly my own understanding. This is nothing that he ever wrote. The rectangle basically mimics our field of vision. That's how we see the world. That's why these screens are rectangular, and television screens are rectangular. Most paintings are rectangular. That's our basic view of the world. And he even makes soft rectangles, because we don't actually see square rectangles. We see more or less an elliptical rectangle. So my sense is that it's just the most natural format for him to basically take over our field of vision, our view of the world. And that's why as the paintings, as he moves through the 1960s paintings, the paintings and the rectangles themselves tend to become wider. He's really filling our field of vision and trying to really control or just get you completely enveloped in that encounter, what he is trying to discuss with you. So I think that it's just the most natural form for him to engage the viewer, and for him to then let the color be, if you will, sort of, I call it the rectangle is the stage, and the color is the dancer on the stage.
What was it like for you as a young child to be in his studio with him when you did studio visits as a youngster?
So I was actually only 6 when my father died. So we're really talking as a young child, and I also noted that he did not like to watch being painted when he was painting. Now my sister, who's 13 years older than I am, got to go to a couple of other studios, and sometimes he would kind of have to babysit. And he's like sort of put her off in the corner to draw and things while he was painting. But with me, I never saw him paint. I only saw the last studio he had, which he took to make the Rothko Chapel commission, and he could actually mock up 3 walls of the chapel in there. So it was a really cavernous space. So I never got to watch him paint, but I did get to be around sort of a portion of that world that he was creating of the chapel, and then the works he painted subsequently. They were always out when I would come to the studio, and I would usually go there every week or two. And he would set up big rolls of just craft paper for me to paint on. I don't think any of those have survived. Thank goodness for the world. And but I think I certainly was thrilled to know that I was in his workspace, kind of doing what he was doing. All right. I have a question in the front here. I don't want to take the mic away from somebody else who was.
We have time for 2 more questions.
2 more, okay.
This is one of the questions.
Thank you very much. Terrific listening to you. I was wondering, as a psychologist, have you ever thought of perhaps some of your dad's work as a form of Rorschach test?
Yeah, so this is something I do talk about in another talk. I call them emotional barometers. I talk a little bit about how we're projecting some of our own feelings onto these paintings. I actually don't think in an ideal situation it's really a projection. If you're really connecting with the painting, there's a lot of him in these paintings, right? There's a lot of him, and you're connecting with that, and you're connecting with your own very personal response. But I came up with the idea of the emotional barometer because I'm fortunate enough to have some Rothkos hanging in my house, and there are days that I really engage with them, and there'll be like a week or 10 days at a time where I just walk right by them. They're in the living room, and I'm on my way out of the house, and I barely even see them. But there are days that I'll stop, and they'll just get me stuck. They'll just get me caught, and I'll walk by one day, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is like really getting right to the heart of me. And another day, like, I'm not actually sure that painting's as great as I thought it was. And here you can argue if you see the painting in different places or you see it in different lighting, but nobody touches my lighting. Once I've got it said, nobody touches that. Woe be to them. So it's the same place, it's the same environment. The only thing, it's obviously the same painting. The only thing that's changed is me. So that's why I call them. They really do. They pull out your feelings, and they pull out different feelings at different times, and they again, they kind of let you know where you are.
Hi. I was just wondering if you knew anything about the move to Marfa and how that influenced the work, or whether Flavin and Judd, I mean, were they obviously pals, but in some way competitive about the rectangle? Sorry, that's harder.
I'm sorry, the move to what?
Marfa to do the chapel.
Oh, to the Rothko
Yeah,
chapel?
did that change the rectangles? Like, did they go from soft to square, or square to soft? I didn't quite follow the chronology well enough.
Yeah, so, basically everything I showed you was chronological, except I jumped way back and then started forward again. So what I actually did not show you was the so-called black form paintings that immediately precede the chapel. So he gets the chapel commission in 1964. We believe, but we don't actually know, that he'd already started this series, as a loose series of works that were the hardest edged, most minimal works of his career. There's one that is brown on brilliant red, and all the others are some version of black or brown on some background that is black or brown. And whether he had started them before the chapel commission or not, they very clearly become a sort of testing ground for him to work out his idea of how do my paintings work when it's a complete environment? How do they work when, instead of having to, occupy a museum wall space, the length of encounter is going to be longer. So, I think that experimentation ultimately influences him becoming more rectilinear in the chapel. And the chapel paintings, 7 of them are actually full monochromes, eggplant-colored monochrome, and the other 7 paintings, am I getting that right? 7 paintings are black on burgundy, but all very hard-edged. And after the chapel, he actually moves away from that a little bit, never to quite the irregularity of the early 50s work, but back more to the 2 and 3 rectangle format that has space between the rectangles, and again, a little softer edge. And the only exception to that is that late series of black and gray paintings where you saw the black and the gray rectangles touching with no space in between. And those are actually quite hard edged. They're actually bound by a white border. I have a whole separate talk on those. So not today, but the reasonably quick answer to your question. All right.
Thank you very much, Christopher. That was great, and clearly your father's painting is much cherished. We have a bunch of events coming up. Do check out our website, Stan Douglas, on February 12th. If you like these talks, consider joining Curator's Circle. It's a fantastic group of supporters. And finally, the Women's Art Initiative carries the legacy on today. There's about 50 women who support exhibitions and purchasing art by great works by women artists. So that continues. So thank you.